Camping with my uncle has always been a summer tradition. It's something he's done his whole life. And now that I'm 15, I've started to really enjoy it too. Last year, we decided to shake things up and find a new spot to camp. We spent hours searching online, poring over maps and descriptions. Finally, we found a place that seemed perfect. The description made it sound like an undiscovered gem, an easy, uncrowded trail leading to a secluded campsite deep in the woods. There weren't any pictures, but the map looked easy to follow, and the idea of exploring somewhere new excited us both. We packed our gear and set out early on a Friday morning, driving until we reached a remote stretch of road where we parked the car. The trailhead wasn't marked, just a narrow path leading into the trees. It was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. But we were ready for the adventure. It didn't take long to realize that the online description was far from accurate. The trail was anything but easy. It was steep in places, muddy and slick in others, with thorny bushes and overgrown branches, making it hard to push through. We stumbled more than once, and the further we went, the more isolated it felt. But we were already deep into the hike, and turning back wasn't really an option, so we kept going, finally reaching the campsite after what felt like hours. The site itself was underwhelming, to say the least. There were no scenic views, just more dense woods surrounding a small, overgrown clearing. The grass was tall and wild, and the trees pressed in close from all sides. It wasn't the beautiful, hidden paradise we'd hoped for, but we were there, and my uncle was determined to make the best of it. We pitched our tents in the uneven ground, set up a small area for cooking, and had a quick lunch. The rest of the day passed in conversation, as it often did, my uncle sharing stories from his younger days while I listened, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease that seemed to settle over the place as the afternoon wore on. As the sun began to sink behind the trees, casting long shadows across the campsite, we decided it was time to gather sticks for a fire. The air had a slight chill, and the light was fading fast. My uncle and I wandered around the area, talking about nothing in particular, enjoying the stillness of the woods. But then, just as we were laughing about something trivial, a loud voice suddenly cut through the air behind us.
No!
It was a man's voice, shouting something we couldn't make out. We both froze, our conversation dying instantly as we spun around to look for the source. The forest, which had been peaceful moments before, now felt heavy with an eerie silence. The voice hadn't sounded far off, maybe a mile away, but in the dense woods, it was impossible to pinpoint where it had come from. We strained our ears, eyes scanning the trees, but all we saw were shadows, and all we heard was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, side by side, staring into the thickening darkness. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. Then, the voice came again, this time louder and clearer. It was no longer just a shout. It was a scream filled with pain and desperation that sent a cold shiver down my spine. I glanced at my uncle, and the look on his face made my stomach twist. I had never seen him look like that before, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a deep, conflicted worry. He didn't say a word, just quickly bent down and started to build a fire with shaky hands, as if the flames could somehow protect us from whatever was out there. But the screams didn't stop. They kept coming, ripping through the stillness of the forest, growing more frantic with each cry. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Shouldn't we help?" I asked, my voice trembling. I could see my uncle weighing the options, his eyes flicking toward the direction of the screams and then back to me. "Stay by the fire," he finally said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm going to check it out, but I need you to stay here, no matter what. Stay by the fire, and don't let anyone near you. Do you understand?" I nodded, my throat too tight with fear to speak. I watched as he grabbed a flashlight and disappeared into the darkness, running toward the source of the terrible cries. The forest seemed to swallow him up instantly, and soon I was left alone with only the crackling fire and the distant, haunting echoes of that man's screams. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an hour. I huddled close to the fire, trying to keep the fear at bay, but it gnawed at me, growing stronger with every passing second. The screams in the distance became more erratic, cutting off suddenly only to start again, as if the man was being tortured. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the screams stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I strained to hear something, anything, but there was nothing. No sound of my uncle, no movement in the woods, just the eerie, oppressive quiet. I stared into the trees, willing my uncle to appear, but the minutes ticked by with no sign of him. The darkness was closing in, the firelight casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the edges of my vision. My mind raced with horrible possibilities, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me as the minutes dragged on. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest shrouded in a thick, oppressive darkness. My uncle had been gone for what felt like an eternity, and the sudden stop in the screaming only made my anxiety worse. A million thoughts raced through my mind. What if something happened to him? What if he was hurt? Or worse, I couldn't take it anymore. Standing up, I left the relative safety of the campsite and started walking in the direction my uncle had gone. The darkness felt alive, the trees looming over me like silent watchers. I strained my ears, hoping to hear something, anything, but the forest was unnervingly quiet. The deeper I walked, the more the dread in my chest tightened, until it was nearly suffocating. Then, just as panic was about to set in, I heard it. Footsteps up ahead. Relief washed over me at first, but as the footsteps grew closer, something felt off. They were too heavy, too deliberate, like someone was purposely trying to make each step count. My heart began to race again, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. Just when I thought I would see who or what was coming toward me, I heard my uncle's voice calling my name from the left. I whipped around to see him sprinting toward me, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Go back to the campsite. Now!" he shouted, urgency dripping from every word. I didn't hesitate. I turned and bolted back toward the campsite, my uncle's footsteps pounding the ground behind me. My mind was a jumbled mess of fear and confusion, but I knew one thing. I needed to get out of those woods as fast as possible. When we reached the campsite, my uncle didn't waste a second. He grabbed our essentials, stuffing them into his backpack with trembling hands. His face was ashen, his movements frantic. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw pure terror in his eyes. "Leave everything else," he muttered, his voice shaking. "We need to go. Now." We ran. We ran harder and faster than I thought possible, the darkness of the forest swallowing us whole. My uncle didn't look back, and neither did I. The only thing that mattered was getting out of there, putting as much distance between us and whatever was out there as possible. We didn't stop until we were a mile away from the car, only slowing down when we were sure nothing was following us. The drive home was a blur of headlights and silent, suffocating tension. I asked my uncle what he saw, who the man was, and why he was screaming, but he wouldn't answer. Every time I brought it up, his face turned grim, his jaw clenched tight, and the same haunted look would settle in his eyes. I gave up trying to get answers. Even now, months later, he refuses to talk about what happened that night. It's as if that part of the trip never existed. But I can't stop thinking about it, the footsteps, the fear in my uncle's voice, and the chilling possibility of what might have happened if he hadn't shown up when he did. Whatever was out there that night, I know one thing for sure. I never want to go back to those woods again. A weekend camping trip with my college friends, Rob and John, was supposed to be a much-needed break from the stress of our final exams. We planned to spend a few days in the woods near our town, away from the noise and crowds. Rob and I were far from experienced campers, but John had grown up camping with his family, so we trusted him to take the lead. He assured us he knew the perfect spot, a secluded area by the river that required a few miles of hiking through dense forest. It sounded like the ideal getaway. The hike itself was tougher than I expected. The trail was narrow, with thick branches, occasionally scraping against our clothes, and the ground uneven beneath our feet. But John moved with confidence, and soon enough, the trees began to thin out. We finally emerged into a vast, empty field on the river's edge, surrounded by towering pines and oaks. The view was breathtaking. The water flowed quietly just beyond the grassy field, reflecting the sky as the sun began to lower. It felt like we had stepped into another world, one that belonged to us alone. We set up our tents in the middle of the field, equidistant from the tree line and the riverbank. There wasn't a soul in sight, and the isolation felt both calming and thrilling. As dusk approached, we built a campfire, the flickering flames casting long shadows over the grass. The crackling of the fire and the gentle rush of the river were the only sounds that filled the air. With the tents up and the fire going, we finally relaxed, opening a few beers and sitting around the fire. We joked about old times, talked about our plans after graduation, and soaked in the peacefulness of the night. Everything was perfect, until I noticed something strange. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the warm glow of daylight faded, leaving long, eerie shadows stretching across the field. It was then that I first noticed them, figures standing just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought they were hunters, their clothes dirty and earth-toned, blending almost perfectly with the surrounding woods. But something about them was off. They had no rifles or any hunting gear that I could see. John noticed them too, his expression immediately darkening. He mentioned that hunting was illegal in these woods, especially out of season, and his unease was palpable. Rob, always the skeptic, waved it off, claiming John was just being paranoid. We tried to let it go and resumed our conversation, but the strange sight left a lingering tension in the air that none of us could fully shake. As night fell and the fire dwindled, we decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, hoping that sleep would come quickly. But the unease from earlier still gnawed at me. The thin walls of the tent offered little protection against the creeping fear that something wasn't right. Every rustle of the wind, every crack of a twig outside, made my heart race. The wilderness, which had felt so peaceful just hours before, now seemed to be closing in on me. Hours dragged by, and sleep remained elusive. My mind replayed the image of those figures at the tree line over and over again. The silence outside grew oppressive, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the quiet was broken by the sound of footsteps. They were soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the natural sounds of the forest, but they grew louder, closer, until there was no mistaking them. Multiple sets of footsteps moving steadily toward our tents. At first, I thought it had to be Rob or John, maybe heading out to relieve themselves. But something was wrong. I hadn't heard their tents unzip, and these footsteps weren't coming from a single direction. There were too many, moving in a line, circling us. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen, every nerve in my body on edge. The footsteps were close now, just feet from where I lay, separated only by the thin fabric of my tent. I expected to see the glow of a flashlight, the silhouette of someone approaching, but there was nothing. No light, no voice, just the sound of feet crunching softly on the grass. My heart pounded so hard, I feared it would give me away. I lay perfectly still, not daring to make a sound, pretending to be asleep, praying that whoever, or whatever, was out there would pass by without noticing us. The footsteps moved steadily past my tent, the sound slowly fading into the distance. But the fear didn't leave me. I knew I should be relieved, but all I could feel was a deep, gnawing dread that this wasn't over, that something far worse was yet to come. The footsteps eventually faded into the night, leaving behind an oppressive silence that weighed heavily on my chest. My heart was still pounding as I slowly unzipped my tent, the sound almost deafening in the quiet. To my left, Rob did the same. Our eyes met in the dim light, both of us wide-eyed with a shared fear we didn't need to voice. We turned our gaze toward the tree line, where the group was barely visible, still moving away, their figures blending into the darkness. But something about their deliberate pace, their eerie silence, told us that this wasn't normal. We both knew then that something was terribly wrong. Without a word, I slipped out of my tent and hurried over to John's. I shook him awake, and he bolted upright, his face pale in the faint glow of the moon. He listened intently as Rob and I explained what we had seen and heard. His reaction was immediate, far more intense than I expected. John wasn't just concerned, he was terrified. He'd been camping his whole life, and for him to be this scared made the situation all the more alarming. We began packing up in a rush, our hands shaking as we shoved gear into our backpacks. The fear in the air was palpable, making every second feel like an eternity. I could hear the tremor in John's voice when he suddenly froze and whispered urgently for us to hurry. I followed his gaze, and my blood ran cold. The group had stopped moving and was now standing at the edge of the tree line, just watching us. There were more of them now, 5 or 6, standing in the shadows, their faces obscured, their intentions unreadable. A wave of panic surged through me, and I fumbled with my bag, shoving everything inside as fast as I could. The only thought in my mind was to get out, get away from them. We didn't dare use our flashlights, afraid the light might draw them closer. Instead, we relied on the faint moonlight filtering through the trees as we stumbled back onto the trail, our feet barely finding purchase on the uneven ground. The darkness felt suffocating, and every sound, every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves made us jump. The path back to the car was a blur of fear and adrenaline. We moved as quickly and quietly as we could, barely able to see the trail ahead. All the while, the dread that had settled deep in my gut only grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that those figures were right behind us, hidden just beyond the reach of our senses. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car came into view. We piled in, slamming the door shut, and John turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence that had clung to us like a shroud. As we sped away from the campsite, I looked back, half expecting to see those figures standing in the road behind us. But there was nothing. Just the dark, empty woods. We didn't speak much on the drive back, each of us lost in our thoughts, trying to process what had happened. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that we narrowly escaped something far worse than we'll ever understand. Whoever, or whatever, those people were, their presence in the woods wasn't a coincidence. They were there for a reason, and I have a sinking feeling that if we hadn't left when we did, we might never have made it out at all. Camping had become my refuge, a way to break free from the monotony of life in my small city. I wasn't the type to hike up mountains or explore rugged trails. I preferred the simple joys of setting up camp, sitting by the fire, and basking in the tranquility of having no obligations or responsibilities. The forest I visited was familiar, just a short 30-minute walk from the parking area. The campsite I favored was nestled by a peaceful lake, a spot I had claimed as my own over the years. Usually it was quiet, with only the occasional camper passing through. But this time, as I approached the clearing, something was different. There was already someone there. Down by the lake, a man was pacing back and forth in the sand. He looked to be in his 30s, wearing generic swimming shorts and a stained white t-shirt that clung to his frame. It wasn't just the unexpected presence of another person that threw me off, but the way he moved, restless, agitated, as if something was bothering him. I hesitated for a moment, then shook it off. It's a public spot, after all, and I couldn't expect to have it all to myself every time. I chose a spot further down the shore, away from him, and began setting up my tent. As I was gathering stones to build a campfire ring, I noticed something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The man wasn't just pacing anymore. He had stopped and was now standing perfectly still, His body turned completely toward me. His eyes were locked on me, watching my every move with an intensity that was unnerving. I tried to brush off the unsettling feeling at first. Maybe he was just curious, I told myself. After all, it's not unusual to see someone new in a familiar place and wonder what they're up to. But every time I looked back, he was still there, standing motionless, eyes fixed on me like I was some kind of spectacle. The longer it went on, the more it got under my skin. It wasn't just casual curiosity, it was something else, something off. I decided to wave, hoping to break whatever weird tension was building between us. Maybe he wanted to say hi, and this could be a way to make things less awkward. But as soon as I raised my hand, he turned on his heel and walked away along the lake's edge, not even acknowledging me. It was like I didn't exist. That weird, uncomfortable feeling settled deeper in my gut. Something about the whole situation didn't feel right. So I kept an eye on him for a while longer. Eventually, he disappeared into the forest behind his tent, leaving me alone by the lake. Relieved, I finally let myself relax. I spent about an hour sitting by the water, letting the tension ebb away with the gentle lapping of the waves. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I lit my campfire, feeling a little more at ease with the familiar warmth and light flickering in front of me. But as I sat there, something out in the woods caught my attention. At first, it was just a faint white shape near a tree, barely noticeable in the dimming light. I squinted, trying to make it out. My heart skipped a beat when I realized what I was seeing. It was the guy. He was standing far out, behind my campsite, just watching me. My mind raced. How long had he been there? How long had he been watching me without me noticing? This wasn't just creepy anymore, it was terrifying. He hadn't moved from that spot, and his eyes were still locked on me. The fire's glow felt like a spotlight, making me painfully aware of how exposed I was, while he remained shrouded in the growing darkness of the forest. I moved my chair to the other side of the fire, positioning myself so I could keep my eyes on him without letting him slip into the shadows unnoticed. He didn't move an inch, just stayed there, watching me with that unnerving stillness. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the forest was swallowed by darkness. The campfire's light flickered, casting long, twisting shadows that made it even harder to see anything beyond the immediate glow. But I knew he was still out there, eyes fixed on me, as if waiting for something. Anxiety gnawed at my nerves, each crackle of the fire and rustle in the trees sharpening my senses to the breaking point. My mind raced with questions. Why was he doing this? What did he want? The longer he stood there, the more sinister his presence felt. Every sound, every movement in the darkness became a potential threat. My thoughts spiraled as the night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. I thought about packing up and leaving, the urge to escape growing stronger with each passing moment. But fear held me back. What if he followed me? What if that was exactly what he wanted? To see me panic, to lure me into the deeper, darker parts of the forest? I couldn't take that risk, so I stayed put, tending the fire, eyes darting to every shadow, every dark corner where he might be hiding. Hours passed, slow and torturous, until finally the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees. The forest started to emerge from the darkness, and I looked toward where he had been standing. He was gone. There was no sign of him at his tent, no movement in the woods, nothing. It was as if he had never been there at all. I didn't waste a second. My hands shook as I hurriedly packed up my gear, every rustle of the leaves making my heart skip a beat. I shoved everything into my backpack, barely caring about the order, and practically ran back to my car. My heart pounded in my chest. The image of him standing there, watching, burned into my mind. To this day, I still don't know what his intentions were, why he spent those hours staring at me from the edge of the woods, never saying a word, never coming closer. But one thing is certain. If I hadn't been so vigilant, if I had let my guard down for even a moment, I might not have made it out of that forest alive.